Hello, this is Tony Hiller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. Journalists seem to be competing for who can generate the fakest Arctic news. There's been an unusually large amount of fake Arctic news over the last couple of weeks. In this video, I'm going to focus on the junk science coming from Fox News and the Washington Post Capital Weather Gang. This chart of solar radiation received at the Earth is from NASA. Along the x-axis is the day of the year, and along the y-axis is latitude. Black means no sunlight like is going on in Antarctica right now. White means peak solar radiation like is occurring in the Arctic right now. Tomorrow is the longest day of the year in the Northern Hemisphere, and as you can see, the maximum amount of solar radiation being received anywhere on Earth is very close to the North Pole. Even though the sun is low in the sky, it's shining all day long and they get a lot of solar radiation during the 24-hour period. And as a result of the large amount of solar radiation being received, it can get very warm in the Arctic during the summer. Here's an account from 1927 about some women who tried to drive to the Arctic Ocean. Through Belgium, Holland, Germany, Denmark, Lapland, and Finland, the motor party journeyed to 270 miles north of the Arctic Circle, prepared for freezing weather. To their continued astonishment, the temperature was never less than 90 degrees in the shade. 90 degrees Fahrenheit is 32 degrees Celsius. The intention was to reach the Arctic Ocean, but 40 miles of marsh country on the coast prevented this. An average of 210 miles a day was made on the journey, which was arduous in the extreme, and at one time the car had an actual race with death among the forest fires in Sweden over terrible roads. So what actually stopped them was melting permafrost in 1927. And they had a race with death against forest fires in the Arctic. And here's another story from the Arctic from 1927, sunbathing near the North Pole. The short summers of the Arctic are very warm, and this youngster sitting in the sunlight needs no protection from the cold. This picture was taken as near to the North Pole as Panama is to the equator. 1927 was a very eventful year. The Red Cross rated it as the worst disaster year in their history. Floods and tornadoes make 1927 the worst disaster year in Red Cross history. The Red Cross sent relief to 111 disasters that year, which included 29 tornadoes, 24 floods, 23 fires, 4 earthquakes, 9 hurricanes, 6 mine disasters, and some cloudbursts, explosions, railroad wrecks, typhoons, and epidemics. The worst floods in U.S. history occurred along the Mississippi during 1926 and 1927. The floods lasted for 6 months and drove hundreds of thousands of people out of their homes permanently. And Vermont also had their worst flood in 1927. There were many disastrous tornadoes in 1927, but the best known one destroyed large parts of St. Louis. But this video is about the Arctic, so let's go back there. April 30th, 1937. Weather stations on the Yukon River in the Arctic have reported temperatures of more than 100 degrees in the shade. So it should be clear now that it can get very hot in the Arctic, and did a lot during the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s. So now let's fast forward to the incredible rash of junk science and fake news in 2019. Here's one from Fox News. Stunning photo shows dogs walking on water amid Greenland ice crisis. Danish meteorologist Stefan Olsen and his band of sled dogs are walking on thin ice across a frozen sea that had become flooded with melted glacial waters. It all started with this tweet from the Danish Meteorological Institute. Stefan got the difficult task of retrieving our oceanographic moorings and weather station on sea ice in northwest Greenland this year. Rapid melt in sea ice with low permeability and few cracks leaves the meltwater on top. And Jason Samenow from the Capital Weather Gang at the Washington Post immediately saw the propaganda opportunities which this photo presented. And then lots of other journalists wanted to jump into the propaganda fest. Here's one. Hi Stefan, I'm a journalist from a Polish news website. Can we use your picture in an article about the current ice sheet melting in Greenland? Stefan quickly responded and corrected the journalist. Note that we are not on the ice sheet here. The dogs are running on sea ice flooded by surface meltwater. The point being that this has nothing to do with glaciers. It was just a warm day and the surface of the sea ice was melting. So now let's go back and look at the Fox News article again. It says, the frozen sea has become flooded with melted glacial waters, even though the person who took the photo made it clear that that was not the case. Stefan made it very clear that this has nothing to do with glaciers, but it doesn't make any difference to fake news organizations. They got their fake story about Greenland melting and they were going to run with it. Then Fox News piled on the BS and said, Olson himself is calling for immediate action. But the action which Stefan called for had nothing to do with climate. What he said was, communities in Greenland rely on the sea ice for transport, hunting, and fishing. Extreme events, here flooding of the ice by abrupt onset of surface melt, call for an increased predictive capacity in the Arctic. I'm not sure why he was surprised by this event because I saw model forecasts from several days earlier predicting very warm temperatures in Greenland at that time. But regardless, the action he was calling for had nothing to do with the misrepresentation which Fox News was trying to create. And then Fox News piled on the BS even deeper. They said, at the same time Olson took this photo, news broke that Greenland has suffered a loss of 2 billion tons of ice already this season, about 40% of their nation's icy expanse. While the country experiences annual melting from June through August, the rate so far this year has been record-breaking. Wow, they claim that there's been record-breaking melt and that 40% of the ice in Greenland melted already this year. This is just complete nonsense and idiocy on Fox News' parts. There's almost 3 billion tons of ice in Greenland. Rather than 40% of the ice sheet melting, the correct number is 0.000007% of the ice sheet. Fox News missed by 7 orders of magnitude. 2 billion tons of ice loss sounds like a big deal until you look at the fact that Greenland can receive 6 times that much in a single day, like they did last November. About 550 billion tons of snow falls on Greenland every year, and it all has to return to the sea, either as meltwater or as glaciers calving into the ocean. Fox News has no idea what they're talking about. They're hiring scientific and mathematical illiterates to do their science reporting. But to be fair, it wasn't Fox News who started this madness. It was the Washington Post Capitol Weather Gang who did. Let's look at their claim. Temperatures leap 40 degrees above normal as the Arctic Ocean and Greenland ice sheets see record June melting, and it may be messing with our weather. And there's the dog sled picture again. By Jason Same now, June 14th, ice is melting in unprecedented ways as summer approaches in the Arctic. In recent days, observations have revealed a record-challenging melt event over the Greenland ice sheet, while the extent of ice over the Arctic Ocean has never been this low in mid-June during the age of weather satellites. Greenland saw temperatures soar up to 40 degrees above normal Wednesday, while open water exists in places north of Alaska where it seldom, if ever, has in recent times. So let's look and see if what Jason Same now is saying is true. This graph is from the Danish Meteorological Institute, the people with the dog sled who are at the center of this discussion. They show that Arctic sea ice extent is the highest in the past several years and just about normal for the date for all recent years. The Danish Meteorological Institute has been interested in and recording sea ice for much longer than any other group, and they have the most reliable data. Jason was happy to use the picture of the dog sled from the Danish Meteorological Institute, but he was also perfectly happy to ignore their actual data. Had he actually talked to the people at Danish Meteorological Institute, he would have known that his claim of record low June sea ice was simply not true. And this is the graph which Jason used for his claim of unprecedented surface melting in Greenland. What he called unprecedented was actually just a little tiny bit higher than 2 years ago, probably within measurement error. And remember what Stefan said about the picture of the dog sled. The water there had nothing to do with the ice sheet melting, so this is actually completely unrelated. There's nothing unprecedented about this event. It's just a little bit higher than spikes in other recent years. It's a fairly common event. It's a propaganda event, not a climate event. Now let's look at the surface melt data from the Danish Meteorological Institute. You can see the graph along the bottom. Most of the summer was below normal melt, and then there was a big spike a few days ago. About 35% of the surface of the ice sheet showed some melting, which is a little higher than a typical day in July. There's no crisis here, it's just a weather event. And if you look at temperatures recorded in the center of the Greenland ice sheet, you can see it very clearly. Temperatures have been quite cold, and then last week there were a couple days where temperatures warmed up and got up close to the freezing mark. But since then they've dropped back down again. Here's what it looks like in the center of the Greenland ice sheet today. It's quite cold, minus 8 degrees centigrade, 18 Fahrenheit, and there's fresh snow on the ground. This next graph from the Danish Meteorological Institute is the surface mass balance. It shows the gain or loss of ice since September 1st of last year. The gray line is the 1981 to 2010 average, the red line is 2012, and the blue line is this year. You can see that the gain of ice this winter was a little below average, and there's been a small amount of melt since the peak a few weeks ago. But melt this year has been pretty small compared to the very steep decline which started in the middle of May of 2012. So once again, Jason Samnow's claim of record Greenland melting simply isn't true. It hasn't been anywhere close to a record. And journalists were strangely silent the last 2 years when Greenland experienced near record snow accumulation. In 2017, the snow accumulation in Greenland was a record high, and the amount of melt was very small, and the melt season ended early. Similar story in 2018. So Jason Samnow ignored 2 years of data which worked against his story and instead cherry-picked 2 days last week. What he's doing is not science, it's propaganda. Now let's look at some of Jason's other ridiculous claims. He said, open water exists in places north of Alaska where it seldom if ever has in recent times. Let's look and see if that makes any sense. This is today's sea ice map from the National Snow and Ice Data Center in Boulder, Colorado. It shows a small gap between the coast of Alaska and where the sea ice edge extends. Let's remember what Jason said again. He said that open water exists north of Alaska in places where it seldom has, if ever, in recent years. He would be implying that this small area of open water north of Alaska is unprecedented. But that's simply not true. Here's a map from 1998 showing that the sea ice has melted way back from the coast of Alaska, and this orange line shows normal for middle of September. So every year the sea ice melts considerably well back away from the coast of Alaska. And here's a 1971 National Geographic Arctic sea ice map which shows a wide gap between the coast of Alaska and the edge of the ice. That gap is much wider than the present gap, which Jason Samnow says is unprecedented. And according to Walt Meyer from the National Snow and Ice Data Center, the Arctic was ice-free 7,000 years ago when carbon dioxide levels were very low. How do they explain that? This gap has opened up a little bit earlier this year than it has in recent years, and let's look at what actually happened with that. It's been cloudy and temperatures have been very cold over the Beaufort Sea. This ice didn't melt, something else happened to it. This animation made from maps from the Danish Meteorological Institute shows what happened to the ice. It flashes back and forth between the current ice extent and where it was a month ago. You can see what happened. Winds blew the ice offshore from the Alaska coast and forced it over towards the eastern Arctic, where they have more ice than they've had in many recent years. So it's not that the ice melted, it's that it moved from the west side of the Arctic over to the east side of the Arctic. Had Jason Samnow from the Capital Weather Gang actually checked the weather over the Beaufort Sea over the last month, he would have known that it's been too cold to have much melting going on. Now let's focus on all this thick ice which is currently around Svalbard, and compare it to this map from 1922. The black area shows the maximum sea ice extent in 1922. It never froze around Svalbard that winter. This is the text from that article. Strange things happening in the frozen Arctic. Is the North Pole going to melt? Reports from fishermen, seal hunters, and explorers who sail the seas about Spitsbergen and the eastern Arctic all point to a radical change in climatic conditions, with hitherto unheard of high temperatures in that part of the Earth's surface. Formerly, the waters about Spitsbergen, Svalbard, have held an even summer temperature in the neighborhood of 5 degrees above freezing. This year it rose as high as 28 degrees. Last winter, the ocean did not freeze over even on the north coast of Spitsbergen. So there's a lot more ice now around Svalbard than there was 97 years ago. And the same story in the Baffin Bay. Here's another article from the Monthly Weather Review, December 1924, Open Winter in Baffin Bay. In my 16 years of Arctic work, I've never seen Baffin Bay so clear of ice as last season. So Baffin Bay was largely open during the winter of 1924. But this year, Baffin Bay is full of ice. It appears that there's more ice in the eastern Arctic than there was 97 years ago. And one of the reasons is because the wind had been pushing the ice from the west side over to the east side. And Jason Samnow is saying this is due to melting, when in fact it has very little to do with melt. It's mostly the wind pushing the ice offshore. Now let's look at Jason Samnow's last claim that Arctic melting caused the flooding and tornadoes this spring. We can show that that claim makes no sense because the record melt year of 2012 was very warm, very dry, and had a very low number of tornadoes. Well, according to NOAA, tornado activity in 2012 was below average and was probably the lowest since 1989. So according to climate alarmists like Jason, sometimes Arctic melting causes tornadoes and floods, and other times it causes the exact opposite. This definitely is not science, what these people are doing. And this isn't the first time this year the Washington Post has pulled the same stunt. There were a couple warm days in April, and the Washington Post immediately jumped on and claimed record Greenland melting. It's been exceptionally warm in Greenland lately, and ice is melting a month early, April 18th. Greenland is baking. Let's look and see if that makes any sense. Let's look at the Greenland melting graph from the Danish Meteorological Institute again and see if the Washington Post claims are accurate. Most of April was just about normal melt, and there was a small spike at the end of the month. But most of the summer so far has actually been below normal melt until the recent spike of the last few days. There's nothing the least bit alarming in this graph going on. Climate alarmists just look for any meaningless statistic they can come up with to generate propaganda. And what about Greenland glaciers? Greenland's two largest glaciers have been growing in recent years. This is the Petermann Glacier in northern Greenland, showing the ice edge in 2012 and showing where the ice edge is now. You can see that the glacier has expanded several kilometers over the last 7 years. And Greenland's other most famous glacier, the Jakobshavn Glacier, is also growing. It's been shrinking for the last 150 years, but in recent years it started growing again. What climate alarmists are doing is they're cherry-picking a warm day here and there and using it to obfuscate the trends which have been occurring over the last few years. Greenland was losing ice 15 years ago, but since then it's either slowed down or reversed. And what about Arctic sea ice? This is the graph from the Multi-Agency Sea Ice Index of Arctic sea ice extent. Their data starts in 2006, and the red line is the 365-day mean. You can see that there's been essentially no change in extent over the last 13 years. You're certainly not going to hear this from people like Fox News and the Washington Post. Greenland is not melting down now, but 80 years ago it was. December 17, 1939. All the glaciers in eastern Greenland are rapidly melting, declared Professor Hans Alman, Swedish geologist. It may, without exaggeration, be said that the glaciers, like those in Norway, face the possibility of a catastrophic collapse. And what about all the ice-free Arctic forecasts? Here's one from 2008. The polar ice cap in the Arctic may well disappear this summer due to the global warming, Dr. Olav Orheim, head of the Norwegian International Polar Year Secretariat, said on Friday. The Arctic wasn't ice-free in 2008, so NASA's top Arctic expert, Jay Zwally, predicted it would be gone by 2012. Mark Cerise from the National Snow and Ice Data Center in Boulder, Colorado, said, "The Arctic is screaming." National Geographic also predicted in 2007 that the Arctic would be ice-free by 2012. The BBC was a little more conservative and predicted there'd be ice in the Arctic until 2013. Cambridge University professor Peter Wadhams said, "In the end, it will just melt away quite suddenly." Nobel laureate Al Gore was even more conservative and predicted that the ice wouldn't be gone until 2014. Gore's predictions were based on predictions from the Naval Postgraduate School predicting an ice-free Arctic by 2014. And James Hansen from NASA, the world's #1 climate alarmist, who started the global warming scare in 1988, predicted the Arctic would be ice-free by 2018, last year. Hansen, echoing work of other scientists, said that in 5 to 10 years the Arctic will be free of sea ice in the summer. This article was written in 2008. And Representative Ed Markey, Democrat of Massachusetts, said, "Dr. Hansen was right. 20 years later we recognize him as a climate prophet." So they've latched onto climate alarmism as their religion and climate scientists as their prophets. The Sierra Club predicted that the ice would be gone by 2013. The Guardian and Cambridge University's Professor Peter Wadhams predicted the ice would be gone by 2015. Well, that forecast failed, so Wadhams changed it to 27 or 2018. We'll see the first ice-free Arctic summer. Journalist Mark Hartsgard predicted the Arctic would be ice-free by 2015 and said, "Say goodbye to polar bears and a whole lot of ice." Polar bear populations are doing just fine, and in many locations, polar bears have become a dangerous nuisance. And to top all of these ridiculous forecasts off, President Obama's science advisor, John Holdren, made the most ridiculous prediction of all. 10 years ago, he said, "If you lose the summer sea ice, there are phenomena that could lead you not so very long thereafter to lose the winter sea ice as well. And if you lose the sea ice year-round, it's going to mean drastic climate change all over the hemisphere." The North Pole doesn't get any sun for 6 months a year. How can it possibly not get below freezing during that 6-month period of darkness? Holdren's claim is just basic scientific madness. H.L. Mencken, the great American philosopher, said, "The whole aim of practical politics is to keep the populace alarmed and hence clamorous to be led to safety by menacing it with an endless series of hobgoblins, all of them imaginary." Since 2007, climate alarmists have been making all these predictions of an ice-free Arctic, yet there's been no change in Arctic sea ice extent during that period. The predictions of an ice-free Arctic have failed miserably, and they've given up on that, and now what they do is they just cherry-pick a warm day here and there and declare it to be a climate apocalypse. Catastrophic climate change is the biggest scam in science history. There's no evidence that it's happening, and even if it was happening, the solutions they're coming up with would be worthless. China and India are building hundreds of new coal-fired power plants. Token gestures and virtue signaling by Western progressives have little or no impact on CO2 levels and definitely not on the climate. And their use of the big lie to push this scam is actually quite dangerous. History shows us that invariably the big lie leads to very bad things happening. We need to put an end to all this junk science and propaganda. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science for a long time.